thank you for keeping the break brief. So we have three wonderful presenters that I'll introduce in a moment. We'll follow the same sort of protocol. I'll introduce all three, and we'll do applause for the end. And then Dr. Paul Murray will begin first, and we'll have two follow. But before I do that, we found a pair of ladies' eyeglasses in the restroom. Do they belong to anyone in here currently? No? Okay. Well, if you hear anyone talking about missing their glasses, send them to me. Also, right after this, we'll go back over to the dining hall where you had breakfast for a lovely lunch that they have prepared for us. It will begin immediately following this session, slated to conclude right before 12:45 at lunch. Also want to encourage you all to continue to check out the books. The presenters, really a lot of their work can be found tangentially and directly in some of the books that are for sale and on display. So again, please check out our publishers, what they've brought and their wares. So without further ado, let's get to introductions. First, we have Dr. Paul Murray. Paul T. Murray retired in 2016 as professor of sociology at Sienna College in Loudonville, New York, after a 44-year career in college teaching. Congratulations. Dr. Murray graduated from the University of Detroit in 1966 and earned his PhD at Florida State University. I went to the University of Florida, so we won't get into the particularities of the rivalry, but maybe for a later time. He is author of numerous articles and reviews in scholarly journals and reference works. His current research focuses on Catholic activists in the civil rights movement. During the 1960s, Dr. Murray was active in the civil rights movement himself. He later served as an expert witness in voting rights cases for the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in the U.S. Department of Justice. He has served on boards of the Albany City School District and the Underground Railroad History Project of the Capital Region, and continues to serve on the board for Sienna College's Martin Luther King Lecture Series. He received the 2004 Jerome Walton Award for Excellence in Teaching from Sienna College. He has organized and led civil rights study tours to Alabama and Mississippi. Dr. Murray also competes in triathlons and long-distance running, swimming, and skiing. He is also a member of the Hudson Mohawk Roadrunners Club Hall of Fame. So without further ado, here is Dr. Paul Murray.
Thank you, Bob. It's a real pleasure to be here, but it's also a little bit intimidating because I look out in the audience and I see people who probably were very active in the young Christian students. And I myself came to know about the young Christian students relatively late in life. It was 8-10 years ago as I was researching activists in the civil rights movement that a couple of people I was interviewing said, yes, I got my start in the young Christian student movement. And I had been a college student in the 1960s, but YCS was not active on my campus. And I said to myself, as I learned more, this is the kind of organization I really would have liked to have been a part of, but be that as it may. I'm a sociologist by training and someone who has spent a lot of time studying social movements. So I'm going to come at YCS from the point of view of being a social movement. And one of the things that struck me as I learned more about the YCS was that it was a very successful movement in a period of time roughly from the mid-1950s to the mid-1960s, and then within a very short period suffered collapse, decline, and simply ceased to exist as a national organization. And certainly that is one of the reasons that is motivating this paper, is to say, what were the factors that were responsible for the decline of the young Christian students? Let me begin with a brief history. Most people probably are familiar with Monsignor Hildebrand, who was definitely the leading mentor for not only the young Christian students, but also the young Christian workers and the Christian family movement, a dynamic priest in the Chicago Archdiocese, had been rector of their seminary at a very young age, formed many of the priests who carried out important social ministries within the city of Chicago. He became involved with the Cardine movement in 1938 and 1939 and became one of its strongest advocates in the United States. One of his partners, Father Louis Putz from Notre Dame, a Holy Cross priest who had been a Joseph's chaplain in France prior to coming to the United States. He organized a early, they didn't call it YCS in those days, but it was a Catholic Action chapter on the campus of Notre Dame, and became a partner with Monsignor Hildebrand, what came to be called the Notre Dame Chicago Axis. That was definitely the greatest strength of the Cardine movement in the United States at that time. And the third figure, in the center of this picture with the white hair, is Reverend Donald Canal. He was, as a seminarian, was at the Louvain in Belgium, where he learned about the Cardine movement and began advocating that in the United States. And it was an address that he gave in Chicago that was is credited with inspiring Monsignor Hildebrand's work. So, 1938 and 1939 were the formative years in the U.S. This is the best picture I can find for Paul Maguire, who was an Australian writer and lecturer, went on a lecture tour of the United States in 1939, sponsored by the Knights of Columbus. And he was proselytizing definitely for the Cardine movement. And young Christian workers groups began to form in the scattered cities across the United States in the wake of Maguire's presentations. However, World War II intervened, and the scattered groups were in communication. More often, their chaplains were in communication with each other. But it wasn't until 1947, December of 1947, when representatives from 23 YCS groups came together in Chicago to form a national charter and establish their national headquarters in Chicago. At that time, 1947, the YCS exists as a nationwide organization with a formal structure. I should say the same thing was happening at the same time with the young Christian workers. They also took their scattered chapters and formed a national organization in Chicago, and they shared office space, and soon, it wasn't that long after, the Christian family movement moved in, and they were certainly working in close proximity and often in coordination with each other. I should say that in what follows here, I'm going to be talking about the college young Christian students, because there also was a high school branch that was active, and I see an alumnus there in the audience. And I did not study the high school division, so I'm going to be talking about what happened in the college division. Following the founding of the organization in 1947 on a national basis, It grew, let's see, there were initially 23 chapters. In the early 1960s, there were chapters at 92 colleges across the United States. Nearly all of these Catholic institutions, most of them smaller liberal arts institutions. At its peak in 1965, there were 138 chapters scattered across the United States. I don't think I'll be giving away the ending to say that by 1968, most of those chapters no longer existed. So we're talking about a very abrupt and steep decline in this organization. Okay, so what were the characteristics of the YCS? Certainly there was an emphasis on the laity being in charge. It was a lay organization with lay leadership. There were moderators, priests and nuns who served as moderators or chaplains, but their role was advisory. It was supposed to be advisory, and it was the students who were taking the leadership role. Yes, in fact, that's not always the case. Okay, well, I understand that. Yes. What happened to my screen here? Can we get some technical assistance? I don't know what went wrong here. Okay, so that was the first characteristic. I will move on. I have them listed here in the paper. I have that. Okay. Maybe it'll come back, maybe it won't. Okay, the second characteristic that I'd like to mention is that YCS was not a mass membership organization. They definitely believed in quality over quantity. And so the idea was to have a nucleus of committed, dedicated students working together rather than to build a large organization. Okay, you'll let me know when that comes back, right? Okay. Third, as everybody should be aware by this point, was the commitment to the Cardine See, Judge, Act methodology. That was definitely the centerpiece of the organization and how it carried out its job. Okay, so that's not coming back either. That's always the case, isn't it? Okay. Number 4, the like-to-like approach in organizing. That is, people should be involved in organizing others like themselves, workers to workers and students to students. That should be the driving principle. And finally was the emphasis on action. One of the things that most appealed to me about the YCS was its emphasis on the necessity of taking action. At this time, it was very popular in many Catholic circles to form study groups, studying labor issues, studying other problems, but often these study groups never went beyond that. And it was part of the philosophy of the YCS that by taking action, people grew in their knowledge, and it was not necessarily going to be gained by studying the issue in books and discussion groups. Okay. In its earliest years, YCS was focused primarily on activities on the campus. Okay, now stay here. All right, there we go. Yes, 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 okay. That's fine. All right. Don't go too far. All right. All right. Certainly, actions that YCS took in its earliest years were primarily centered on the campus. But as the times began to change in the later part of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the focus shifted to national and international issues as social movements for change began to take a larger center stage in the United States, so too the young Christian students became more involved. One person that I would like to talk about, a person who epitomizes much of the values of the YCS during this period, was a young woman by the name of Maria Varela. I don't know if anyone is familiar with Maria, but she's a truly remarkable individual. She was the daughter of a working-class Mexican-American father and an Irish-German mother. She joined YCS as a high school student in Chicago. She went to Alverno College in Milwaukee, where she became student body president, and following her graduation, she became an organizer for YCS, part of its national staff. She came to YCS with the conviction. This is Maria came to YCS with the conviction that lay believers, these are her words, are obliged to engage in their respective milieus to bring about communities of justice and love. She read Rerum Novarum, and she agreed with the Pope's command that Catholics must go beyond acts of charity for the oppressed and work together with them for the reconstruction of society. She was definitely convinced that students needed to be involved in working to change the societies in which they lived. When Maria finished her 2 years working on the national staff, she traveled to the South. She began working as an organizer for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. She continued working in the South for 4 years. She later moved to New Mexico, where she organized cooperatives among workers and agriculturalists in the highlands of New Mexico. She continued throughout her life to be a community organizer. I'm skipping over an awful lot already. Okay. I'm going to identify the event that I see representing kind of the beginning of the decline of YCS, or perhaps illustrating the tensions. Okay? A young woman by the name of Kathy Sullivan became an organizer for the YCS in the New England states. And she became very upset at the discipline directed to 3 Catholic priests, 3 Catholic activists. There was a Father Bonaventure O'Brien at my college, Sienna College in New York, who was disciplined for criticizing the democratic political machine in the city and advocating for poor people. He was disciplined and silenced. There was a Reverend Anthony Mullaney at St. Anselm's College in Manchester, New Hampshire. He was silenced after he invited pacifists and draft card burners from the Catholic worker movement to speak on his campus. And Father Daniel Berrigan, the Jesuit, who was sent very quickly on a tour of Latin America after he had become too outspoken criticizing the Vietnam War. So Kathy decides that she is going to initiate a fast to protest the silencing of these 3 priests. She chooses to do it in the cathedral, St. Joseph's Cathedral in Manchester, Vermont, and probably her fast would not have gained too much attention if she had not talked to a reporter who asked would she be willing to fast until death, and she said, yes, that might be necessary. this suddenly became quite a news story. It also became a problem for YCS because she had issued an announcement of her fast, identifying herself as a YCS organizer. And people from YCS were understood that they could participate in protests as individuals, but not as representatives of the organization. Kathy was called to Chicago. I should say her fast ended after a day and a half when her father and her uncle came to New Hampshire and I think bodily escorted her out of the cathedral. She was called to Chicago. Monsignor Hildebrand conferred with her. It was announced that Kathy was resigning from YCS to pursue other interests. It was very clear that Father Monsignor Hildebrand had insisted that she cease her affiliation. Two main reasons. Number one, of course, she was openly criticizing the diocesan and order leaders who had disciplined these three priests, and she had chosen as the site of her protest a cathedral, which was viewed as sacrilegious by many people. But she was also raising the issue of patriotism and pacifism, because Reverend Hildebrand definitely, while he respected Dorothy Day, he disagreed with her fundamentally on the issue of pacifism. And when YCS leaders attempted to invite Father Phil Berrigan to speak, Hildebrand asked, what's he going to talk about? He's going to talk about the war. Well, in that case, he can't come. You know, he was definitely adamant that was not an area that he wanted YCS to be pursuing. Okay, I'm skipping over some things, but there was a great back and forth within the organization. Within 2 years, the organization had pretty much collapsed. Okay, here we go. There's the three priests. So in 1967, you can read here what they're saying. Despite the commitment to our values, our inability to define relevant areas of action has caused this movement to become very weak. 1967, November, that was the last issue of the YCS Bulletin. By 1968, the office had closed. Scattered chapters remained operative, but YCS as a national movement ceased. I should point out that the YCS was not alone. YCW ended at almost the same time. The National Federation of Catholic College Students ended at about that same time. To go to larger national organizations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee fell apart in 1968. Students for Democratic Society split into several different feuding factions. The National Student Association continued to operate, but was definitely in decline after the revelation that they had cooperated with the CIA. So, what were the reasons? Here we go for the reasons. This is going to be very short. Number one, I would say, and kind of underlying everything else, is that young Catholics had moved much more into the mainstream of American society. YCS had played a vital role in linking young Catholics to national movements for social change in the early part of the 1960s, but that was becoming less important as young students were able to make those connections on their own. Vatican II, although the members of YCS were very enthusiastic about the decrees coming out of Vatican II, especially the discussion of the role of the laity, In subsequent years, they were very frustrated by the slow implementation of many of those reforms, and they found that this church was not living up to many of the things that they felt had been promised. And third, certainly there was changing values on the campus, and as the social movements of that time became more radicalized, there was a growing reaction against them. So, roughly a 20-year span for the young Christian students. I think it was a remarkable organization and one that I continue to admire. Let me go to my conclusions here. Okay. So in the middle decades of the 20th century, young Christian students helped Catholic college students join national and international movements for social justice. YCS insisted that they were a part of a movement and not a conventional organization with the goal of perpetuating its own existence. So when the national organization ceased to exist, they shed no tears but embarked on careers working to realize the ideals that had motivated them. I want to close with a quote from Maria Varela. She said, "If there had not been a YCS at Alverno, I'm not sure what would happen to me in terms of growth that was rooted in the foundation of critical thinking within a social justice or liberation theology." Those of us who were not part of YCS, myself, I guess I'm speaking for here, continue to be inspired by the example that they set for us. Thank you.